And you look now from a healthy perspective, it's like what in me didn't walk away, but that brokenness, that fear, that lack of confidence and independence didn't have the ability to be like, okay, bye. But what really put things into perspective is when Audrey, my oldest, she was one, or under the age of one, my first husband threw something and it hit her instead of me. And I went from being a mom that was totally present and totally available to being completely unavailable for my kids, which is a whole nother, it's beautiful now. My kids and I have a wonderful, wonderful relationship, but created a whole series of trauma for them to try to reconcile who they thought their mother was versus who she is. So,
Yeah.
which was a whole nother journey. I woke up one day and was like, this isn't healthy.
Yeah.
This isn't how a mom should behave. And just like that was like, got to get things in order. We're all figuring out ways to not have to really look inward until they don't serve us anymore. My integration coach or prep coach, whatever, was like, well, I'd love for you just to set one intention. And I'm like, Katie, I don't know. She's like, I just want to be 5 again. And just blurted like, it's just what came to mind. And she was like, okay. Well, little did I know that meant all hell breaking loose.
Kelly, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Every episode begins with gratitude. And in your case, the gratitude is for your advocacy work. So the way that we connected initially was you appeared on a panel to talk about psychedelics and your experiences with that, and also how you came to be introduced to that community through your husband's experiences with PTSD. And we will get into all of that during the interview, but you have now become a voice for psychedelic healing and also integration and recovery from addiction. And I wanted to say that I really appreciate you talking about these topics.
Yeah, I'm super, super grateful that you listen and super grateful to have the opportunity to share my experience, our experience, and hopefully be some light for other people.
Yeah. So I wanted to take it all the way back to childhood. Where did you grow up?
I grew up what used to be the west side of Houston, and was pretty much in the same house from when I was 5 until I graduated high school and went on to college.
And I always find this question to be one of two parts. There is the perception pre psychedelics and the perception post psychedelics. Before you started doing the medicine work, how would you have described your childhood?
Okay, so I would back it up to pre. It wasn't psychedelics that opened up my mind. It was actually my divorce that triggered some stuff. So that was a couple years before psychedelics, but it went from this kind of just fantasy land of a childhood. My mom had described herself as Peter Pan, our world as a Never Never Land, and it was created as this like happy, wonderful world that was very little ever went wrong, and we just all enjoyed life and had fun and had a family unit that was all connected and for each other and about each other.
Yeah. What was the actual reality?
The actual reality was that it was an environment where things needed to appear happy, so that pain wasn't felt or pain didn't exist, and it wasn't an environment where truth was accepted. You couldn't explore other options or other perspectives other than things being happy and wonderful all the time.
Yeah. What would be the reaction when there was pushback on that idyllic fantasy of what life was like?
Um, for the most part, and I know we discussed a little bit before the podcast, my a very few specific memories from childhood, but I do know from adulthood and talking, it couldn't have been accepted well.
Yeah.
It definitely talking about things, bringing things to light. I mean, I think of some specific incidences with my mom and her dad, or my mom and one of her brothers, where I'd want to talk about something and we just didn't talk about it. I do remember a trip we went on, and some people were worshiping in a way different than we were. And my mom was like, "Oh, you can't see that," because she was so afraid of us being exposed to something other than what she was comfortable with.
Right. That's so interesting.
Yeah,
What age were you when you first got married?
I was 23.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned on the panel that that was quite a chaotic relationship. What did that look like for you? Or at least how did that progress?
Yeah. Um, and I should say that was just another in a long series of relationships that was just me trying to feel whole. And I ended up pregnant with my oldest, and didn't see any other options other than getting married. And I mean, I didn't realize that I was marrying someone that was so unbalanced and that was had so many mental health issues. I just thought we were young, and he was immature and needed to grow in some areas, and we would be fine. And then going home wasn't an option. My parents made it very clear that this was my life now, and I needed to fix it, as if something was grievously wrong with it.
Right.
So in hindsight, it was wrong before it ever started. I mean, it was his erratic behavior, the cycle of verbal and emotional abuse existed when we were dating before I got pregnant. But then when we got married, I definitely, with my upbringing, you didn't get divorced. Like, we were married, and this was going to be my life.
Yeah.
And he tried to talk me into a divorce on our honeymoon. So it was,
Wow.
I know, and you look now from a healthy perspective, it's like, what in me didn't walk away, but that brokenness, that fear, that lack of confidence and independence, didn't have the ability to be like, okay, bye. But what really put things into perspective is when Audrey, my oldest, she was one, or under the age of one. My first husband, threw something, and it hit her instead of me.
Mhm.
And I purposed then never to make him mad again, and spent the better part of 14 years doing a really good job of that. Um, and really went into survival mode. In hindsight, I'd been in survival mode because of my childhood,
Yeah.
but I went like into a whole nother level of survival mode that I turned into my mom. Like, and it was a survival skill that I'm forever grateful for, because I went into making everybody's world perfect.
Yeah.
And I did that, and the emotional and verbal abuse continued, but he traveled so much and was gone all the time that it just didn't affect me the way it did, but keeping that world perfect, until I couldn't do it anymore. But it afforded me the ability to be a stay-at-home mom because he was making plenty of money,
Yeah.
or so I thought. And I had a wonderful time with my kids. But when the floodgates finally broke 14 years later, it was like there's a lot of damage control to be done. But it wasn't until, um, really, we'd been married 13 years, and um, my kids were old enough, and I was starting to work and create a business for myself. And the healthier and the happier I got, the more angry he got, and the less I was able to control that situation, because my codependency was starting to break. I mean, it still took another quite a few years to like fully come out of that codependency, but I was starting to be a lot more autonomous.
Yeah.
And so the more I did that, the more furious he got. And for the first time in my life, I had people that were around me enough that saw the cracks and gave me permission. They're like, they didn't encourage me to get a divorce, but they're like, you don't have to live like this, and you can do things other than what you're doing than to take this. And so for the first time, I saw life outside of my crazy world.
Yeah. So, how did that marriage end?
Um, Very quickly. I literally had never thought of the word divorce. As far as in my context, obviously, I'd thought of the word, but I never entertained the idea of getting a divorce. Like I said earlier, I'd purposed that this was the life I had created, and I was going to make the most of it. Um, and he tried to divorce me many times after our honeymoon and said he was leaving. And of course, I would grovel and do whatever it took to keep him to stay. But in 2013, I took my kids. We were on a road trip to see my sister in Oklahoma, and I got there about 10 o'clock at night. And as I was pulling into the driveway, I got a text message from him that said, um, "I won't be home when you get back." And I
Wow.
texted back, "Okay," and I never looked back. It was hard, and I hit like it was messy. But as far as I mean, in that instance, went from okay, I'm done, to I mean, never having thought about being done to being done.
Yeah.
And I went home, and I was divorced in 60 days, um, which was it is virtually unheard of in Texas, and is complicated um, as things were financially. But he signed everything away other than the kids. I got full rights to my kids, and no debt. And so I was like, well, I can do anything with no debt,
Yeah.
And so he just, I think he was so arrogant, and he was so used to everything being able to manipulate things into where he wanted to, that he just signed whatever I put in front of him. Um, and and I had agreed. I said to him, if you will demonstrate that you're willing to work on this, I will pause the divorce. Because in Texas, there's no legal separation. So the only way to stop things financially, to begin any sort of severance, is to file for divorce. And then you operate under the temporary orders. And I said, I'll stay under the temporary orders as long as you pursue healing. And he couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And I mean, we went to one person. Um, he actually found him, and Josh went first, the first several sessions, and he was like, okay, I'm ready for you to come. And we went and had a whole session. It was actually, the guy was brilliant. I don't remember his name, but I was thrilled. I was like, oh my gosh, he's got Josh's number. And we left. And as soon as we closed the door, he said, did you hear how crazy that guy said you are? And I was like, this is never going to work. Like, he couldn't, like, I left encouraged. I was like, my marriage actually may work, and this might be salvageable. And then I walked out the door, and he was like, I cannot believe how crazy he said you are.
Yeah, he's on your side. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, of course.
And so it was just more of the same. So yeah, yeah, I was divorced. I filed and was divorced in 60 days.
Was it a clean break? Like, did he continue to try to play these mind games, or was he just out?
No, gosh, no. No, the mind game, that oh my gosh, the mind game was hard. The mind game was, I mean, it almost did me in, because I'd made up my mind not to go back, but I had no tools. I had zero tools. As I'd said, I had no emotional vocabulary, and my coping mechanism had been guys. So I was left with no way to cope, and three little kids. And I mean, he ramped it up 100%. I mean, it was unbelievable, and went after me with my family. I mean, I'm still estranged from my family because of this. And my family has a different perspective. They would say it's because of me, and they're entitled to their perspective.
Sure.
But it took a lot of work to separate. It took into my first marriage. I mean, my husband now, Devin, is a saint I mean, on a lot of levels, but when it comes to that, he was so patient. I mean, because we were married, and it was still, I mean, my ex-husband would try to drag me into these texting conversations, and I'd want to throw up, and I'd be beside myself because he'd make threats about the kids and threats about the child support and all this stuff, and I would just revert back to that old panic, utter panic. It took years to, and I was so codependent. I mean, I didn't understand what codependency was, really, until my daughter. Entered a recovery with my daughter, um, but yeah, no, it was a mess, and I hit bottom. I mean, I absolutely hit bottom because I had no coping mechanisms, um, and I became a person that I had never become before. I mean, it was thoroughly unpleasant. I was drinking to beyond excess, and my sweet kids saw more than kids should ever see. I went back to my old coping mechanisms of guys. I ended up having an affair. Um, it was a really messy 3 months. But going back to our earlier comment, I woke up one day and was like, "This isn't healthy.
Yeah.
This isn't how a mom should behave." And just like that, was like, "Got to get things in order." And still didn't have any tools, but knew that I couldn't be drunk and have my kids pick me up off the floor.
Yeah.
And I don't laugh because it's funny, but it just was like, this isn't right. And I went from being a mom that was totally present and totally available to being completely unavailable for my kids, which is a whole nother, it's beautiful now. My kids and I have a wonderful, wonderful relationship, but created a whole series of trauma for them to try to reconcile who they thought their mother was versus who she is.
Yeah.
Which was a whole nother journey.
So when did you meet your now husband, Devin?
Um, I met him in 2012, probably, or late 2011. But yeah, it's funny. I met him through his daughter. First his mom. So I was in a Bible study that his mom led. Um, and in hindsight, I heard her wrong because I thought it was just her granddaughter that was coming to live with her. Um, and the short version is I was at the preschool, my son, and then my now stepdaughter were at the same preschool, different grades, but same preschool. And I went to visit him for lunch and saw her playing. And then I saw her get in trouble. Um, and she was doing something she wasn't supposed to, but her motive was good. And so I just had this heart for her. Like it just stole my heart because I felt bad for her. Because if the teacher had really been paying attention to her as a person, she wouldn't have gotten in trouble, which links back to me wanting to be understood.
Right.
Like one of the universal themes in my life is that I was misunderstood and I have this deep need to be understood. So I had this just huge connection with her because I was like, oh my gosh, she's so misunderstood. So I came to find out that it was my Bible study leader's granddaughter. Um, and then the short version is I got to know her and invited her to come to our farm a couple days a week after school because my now husband, her dad, was working. And so she was basically had to chill out every day after school. I was like, let her come to the farm. Like
Yeah.
she needs freedom. Just let her be her. She can run around. It's 80 acres. You know, she can have a ton of freedom and just hang out. And for the next year and a half, 99% of my communication was with the grandparents, my now in-laws, and coordinating because I'd pick her up from school and they'd come pick her up, and then had very little interaction with my husband Devin, and but then in April of 2013, he came to pick her up, and I was like, I need you to know that if I like am not available or I don't have little D over, or she says I'm kind of just preoccupied, I said I'm in the middle of a divorce, and so things are just a little bit crazy right now. And he looked at me and he was like, okay, if you ever need to talk, let me know. And then got in his car and drove off. Like he couldn't have gotten out of there fast enough. And we laugh now, but it was a little bit like, oh crap, we're now the only two single people in this small town. Some of the only single people at this church. Like I don't like, not that he didn't want anything to do with me, but it was like, I don't want my hands in this.
Yeah.
And so we didn't really start talking until Christmas of that year. He texted me over Christmas and said something, I don't remember what, but then in January of 2014, we had our first date. And so that ended up creating a lot of problems for my kids because I had told them when we got a divorce that I was never dating and I was never remarrying and it was going to be us against the world. And really to this day that they'll tell you that that was one of the hardest things was for them to see me date and then get remarried, you know, and we have wonderful conversations about it now. It's really actually I'm really grateful that they'll be honest about just how they felt and where they were. But I realized in the process that I'd grieved the loss of a marriage 13 years ago, you know, or at that, you know, and I mean, you know, we got married in 99. I had my first child in January of 2000. Um, and sometime in that first year when I realized I was going to have to keep the wraps on everything, you know, as I told you earlier, I grieved the loss of a marriage then,
Yeah.
you know, and so I didn't necessarily process it in a healthy way, but it was much like people who lose a spouse to cancer. That has been a long battle.
Yeah.
You know, it's
The writing was already on the wall.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it wasn't like I was divorced and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I don't have a marriage. Yeah.
Yeah. So you start seeing Devin I'm curious, was he still active military at that point?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No, he'd been out for several years at that point. So
And then I would assume that, you had already had this experience in your first marriage and you had done at that point some of your own healing work. Were things very different this time around in terms of like, were they more stable, more healthy out of the gate?
they definitely were more stable and healthier, as much as we both of us could be. I mean, in hindsight, we are both disasters.
Yeah.
But going back to, I wasn't going to repeat the same problem twice, same mistake twice. So I really purpose to have other people tell me if I was crazy. Like, is he the same as Josh? Is he different? Is this relationship different? And I was still drinking more than I should. And it's funny because my kids blamed Devin, but really it was just a coping um, strategy for me, which would have been happening whether Devin was around or not. But definitely, we thought we were healthy and happy. We were definitely happy, but we it was open, real conversations. There was demonstration of change. Like if I said, "Hey, this bothers me," to the best of my ability, he would do something to work on it. So it was reciprocal. In things where if we had a fight or an argument, there was improvement. And in fact, one of my favorite things he would say is, "Okay, what can we do to not end up here again?"
Yeah.
So he was solutions based. So it got messy later, but that's a different part of the story. But yeah, at the time, it was definitely as healthy and happy as it could be.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like there was a lot of accountability on his part, and then also willingness to do the work or willingness to change.
Yeah, yeah. He definitely thought there was part of him that would never be fixed. I mean, he did say that. He was like, "I need you to know I mean, he was like, and at the time, we didn't know he had TBI, but a traumatic brain injury. But he said, with my PTSD, you need to know there's part of me that'll never be fixed.
Yeah.
And I just was like, I don't agree with you, but okay. I was like, if that plan proves out to be true, that's okay. So he was definitely willing to recognize that there was a very wounded part of him.
Yeah, I mean, what did that look like for him? Like when he said never be fixed, like in what ways was that showing up for him?
Um, he just an ability to attach in certain areas, an ability to let go of control. And he was phenomenal at hiding his control. Like people would have never said he was controlling, but it's very subtle on how he controlled his environment to keep it stable. Um, and that he would never feel whole and always have to manage himself, like always live in fear that he might lose it at some point. And I'm very grateful. His PTSD was depression and anxiety, is how it manifested. It was not violent. And so I never, um, and had it presented that way, I would never have married him just because of my first marriage. But
Yeah.
even at the time, he was so good at hiding his depression and anxiety that I got teeny tiny glimpses of it. Um, but yeah, I think he just never thought that he would be whole and always have to live, making sure he controlled himself so that all hell didn't break loose.
Yeah. So with all of these control mechanisms in place, what was your perception of where he was at the time? Like, were you aware that he was struggling with this stuff, or had he put such a good spin job on it that you hadn't really noticed it?
Had such a good spin job on it that I didn't really notice it. Like I thought it was like, I mean, for a lot, like comparing it to cancer, I thought it was, in remission, so to speak. Um, and Yeah, there was one glimpse where one night he did snap. He totally snapped. And he didn't, like, it was interesting. I watched him just get this glaze over his face and he didn't ever remember it. Um, but his dad came and got him. I called Trent and I was like, can you come get Devin? But he'd done such a good job of managing it and figuring out how to keep his world. But the other component is, we met right after a downward swing. So he was on an uphill trajectory when we met. And then the newness of a relationship, the positivity, all of that gave him a boost. I mean, you're familiar with the trauma and the pain. It's like, like an adrenaline shot,
But,
right?
but also like the novelty of a relationship and
Exactly.
like that opportunity to pretend to be fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so even though we both thought we were being real, in hindsight, it enabled him to hide it for a couple more years,
Yeah.
really.
So how did things start to progress in that area? Like, how did things further start to come off the tracks to the point where you guys decided to seek help for this?
Um, it was a slow digression. A lot of it was with work. He At the time, his our main source of income for him was we had 5 Papa Murphy's store in the Houston area, um, and his like he just got bored with it. And part of that, I mean, is just because it wasn't once he opened them, it didn't require the mental work, and so because his brain wasn't in gear, it created room for the depression and anxiety. Um, and then he life just started to fall apart on a lot of different levels. We flooded. We owned at the time. We owned 50 acres, and my income was horse boarding and horseback riding lessons. And we lost everything, which meant my income too, because we lost. I mean, and so I wasn't really making money, so more of the financial burden. And when we married, we knew we were going to be a 2 income household because he was, a new business owner, and I brought 3 kids to the marriage, which had not been on his financial plan at all. So, so the first flood that put a lot more pressure on him.
Was that during the hurricane?
That was before the hurricane. So in our area, we have what in 2017 we had the Memorial Day and the tax day flood. Um, and our area flooded on tax day, and we didn't flood. So we thought we were fine. So when the Memorial Day flood came, we didn't think we would flood, but we did. Um, and then was Harvey in 2017 or 2018?
I think 2018.
Yeah. So that was 2017 that happened. And then we started to rebuild. We tried to decide what we were going to do. Um, we ended up getting campers and living on the property. So my insanely strong kids, we were blending a family because we'd been married in 2015, flooded in 2017. And we were living in 2 different campers on the property and trying to rebuild. And we had this contractor that started off really gracious, and we were rebuilding a house, raised it, all that stuff. And and then the contractor walked in 2018, and then Harvey hit, and we flooded again. And 3 weeks before that, I shattered my tibia
Wow.
and didn't walk for 6 months. So there was a series of like insane pressures on my husband, on all of us, but
Yeah.
right, but for someone that had been managing his controls very well, all of like there was just the rug kept getting pulled out from underneath him. And he had tried to start, well, he hadn't tried, he did, he's very successfully started several online businesses. But what would happen is he'd start these businesses, he would do really well and make money, and then just quit. I'm like, what's happening? Like, you can't stop. And he did it over and over and over again. Um, and I told him, I'd done enough healing at that point and continued to work on myself that I said, these aren't battles. These aren't, military missions where you get your orders, you go do the mission, and once the mission's over, you quit. Like, these are jobs, and you've got to help provide for our family. Like, you can't quit. And he was not really impressed with my analogy at the time. He was like, that's not cool. But in hindsight, that was absolutely a pattern of coping, right? Like the fun was out of it. It was done. He didn't,
Yeah.
and so, um, and then in 2018, I also found out that my middle child was struggling with cocaine addiction. And so he, that kind of gave him a boost to like try to be stable and stabilize a little bit, but it didn't work. And so it just became unsustainable. Our world was falling apart so much that maintaining control wasn't an option. So it was, yeah, it just continued to get more messy.
Did he connect that this might have been rooted in the TBI and PTSD stuff, or did he just kind of think he was subject to internal factors?
No, he definitely connected it, with the PTSD. He just thought it was unfixable, because he'd gone through the VA, he'd done private counseling, he'd done medication, he'd done no medication, um, and he used, I mean, his only relief for a long time was cannabis.
Yeah.
But then I pulled that out from underneath him because when we found out my daughter was struggling with the drug addiction, I was like, "There's no way drugs are gonna be in my house, like none whatsoever." And um, that was a good idea, but I didn't at the time realize I was really pulling away from him his only thing keeping him alive, in that sense. And so it made it even more difficult because if he was going to have cannabis, he was going to have to sneak it, because I had made it absolutely unequivocally clear that we were not going to have it in the house,
Yeah.
and that he was not to come home high. So there was his main way of coping was gone.
When you put this limit on that as coping mechanism for him, was it already problematic, his usage at that point? Like, was he self-medicating to a degree that was unhealthy, or was it the fact that it got taken away that really ramped it up?
I think it was more of the latter. Like I think it's more that it got taken away, but it definitely, because it didn't incapacitate him. Like I could tell he would get more irritable, and I could tell he was disengaged. I mean, you can tell when someone's high, right? Like
Yeah.
but he was still able. I mean, he was still loving us well, showing us up, being part of the family. He wasn't on the couch all day doing nothing, but he definitely was still depressed. Like I would have to get him out of bed. There were many, many days where he was not going to face the day if I hadn't, in my codependency, made sure that he faced the day. And I was the one keeping checklists of what we needed to do, and I was definitely the driving force behind productivity. Um, but it wasn't, what people think of like a pothead that's just sitting in their room, all day
Yeah.
like that. So it was, but it definitely not having that coping mechanism really pulled out, you know, in a good way, kind of raised the bottom because he had to hit bottom sooner.
Yeah. How did you guys start on this new phase of healing in terms of the experiences with psychedelic therapy?
Yeah, that the roots of that are in my daughter, with struggling with an addiction to cocaine. We When I found out that she was using cocaine, and always makes fun of me, like if she listens to this, she's gonna be like, "You still said snorting cocaine," but because I'm just drugs have not been my thing, so all the lingo she still laughs. But intuitively knew it was a family problem, and we talked a little bit about it off mic. And so I hit the floor running of like, we were going to fix this as a family. But I also knew I couldn't make someone sober. Like but she was 16. And I was like, I own you for 2 more years. And I will do everything in my power to give you the tools to heal. And I hope you do. And I'm very grateful she did. Very, very, very grateful. We were in and out of rehab and mental health hospitals from August 2018 until December of 2018. And then we found an incredible recovery community, Cornerstone Recovery, in Houston. And it's a family. Like you're all in. You don't drop your kid off and ask them to fix the kid.
Right.
It's like the only way this kid's going to change is if you change. And so it was a whole family event. And Devin went through the motions. Devin showed up. He was there. He didn't have buy-in. He I mean, he would say that himself. He just, but he wanted to be present. Like in this heart of hearts, he wanted to have buy-in. He wanted to be there. He wanted to heal. He wanted the family to heal. Um, but there wasn't buy-in. He didn't think it would work. But as Joe would say, who's one of the people head of Cornerstone, if you bring your butt, your head will follow. And so Devin kept showing up, and through the 12-step program and understanding the value of community and accountability and making amends, all of those things started taking root. And although he wasn't really taking action, they were starting to ruminate. So as things continued to get worse for him, he had that vocabulary and that awareness. Um, and he saw the change in Emerson. He saw the change in me, and he was seeing changes. Um, but he was continuing to go downhill. And then because we'd lost everything, once my daughter was stable enough, I needed to get a job. And so I got a job at a restaurant managing, well, I started out as a hostess, but anyway, one of the girls with whom I was working, her now husband, um, was a SEAL. And Natalie is what was just a wonderful friend, and she would listen, and we realized that we shared some similar struggles and the PTSD, and it was through her that we learned that some of Devin's behavior was from a traumatic brain injury. Just as she described it, it was like, oh wow. And so it was her now husband that had gone down and was one of the first people to go down with the mission within with Martine, and so I asked Devin if he would be willing to talk to her husband, and he was like, sure. And we went to dinner, and he talked to him, got a bunch of information, and it was still 2 more years because he was so scared to let go of control.
Yeah.
So scared. So it took 2 more years of just continuing for things not to get better, and in some ways get worse before he really was like, you know what? It can't get any worse. And he true. Now, after the psychedelics, Devin said, I realized that if psychedelics hadn't worked, I would have come home and killed myself. Um, and so it was a long process because that was February of last year. So we got married in 2015. And it was 6 years before he really got to a point where he thought there was hope.
Yeah.
And that was his last straw, was to go, because he's, as I said, he likes things to be controlled, and cannabis you're only out of control for a short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that I think maybe not a lot of people are aware of, is when people are really good at controlling this image and like putting out this perception of everything being fine, that decline can be very, very slow. Like that person can white knuckle that for a very, very
Mm-hmm.
long time. But at the same time, they're also going through hell trying to not just manage that internal conflict, but manage this external image.
Yep.
So there is a lot there that I wanted to ask about, but going back to your daughter's struggles with addiction, people familiar with the space would say like this very rarely happens in isolation. Were there warning signs before that about her struggles or other ways that she was acting out before cocaine?
100%. And the more I lean into this space with psychedelics, and I really am doing a lot of educating myself on nutrition and trauma. Um, and yeah, I could have told you that in hindsight, since she was little, I mean, even just her addiction to sugar, right? If I had known, and her being an adrenaline junkie, and her pleasure seeking, and
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of hindsight, and my denial. I mean, I was such a raging codependent, and desire for things to be okay, that I mean, she she's so wicked smart. I mean, everybody that meets her says that she's going to do something insanely incredible someday. And her sheer existence is incredible. I don't mean to diminish that, but it's she one of the first signs that I completely missed was that she started a vape business. So when she's 15, 16, her dad's she got her dad's credit card with his permission, because he didn't, he'd fine have it. And she was buying vapes and different things, and this was really before it got to be a big deal. Like it wasn't as common.
Yeah.
And she would buy them online and then sell them to the kids in the neighborhood. And she was like, I made, and like afterwards, after it came out, she was like, I made $1,000 in 3 weeks. I'm like, okay, brilliant business idea, but you realize you could go to jail because you're basically selling drugs. You're basically a drug dealer. But even her, she was a kid in the divorce that, that's a whole nother conversation, the psychology of divorce and kids. But she was the kid that was 100% on my side. My oldest was on my side as well, but there's some another, details to that. She was 100% on my side, and she was like gonna not talk to her dad, and it was that's a whole nother story. But where I'm going with this is she and her sister weren't going to see her dad. They weren't going to be with her. We'd even had the cops come to her dad's house, and they said to the police, "We don't want to be at our house." Like they had gone to extreme measures to not have to be with their dad.
Yeah.
But then, a couple years afterwards, Emerson started wanting to be at her dad's. And wanted to be her dad's. Well, it turns out because she could party there, she could get whatever she wanted there. She could, get his medications if she wanted to. So she had total freedom to do whatever she wanted at her dad's. So
Yeah.
yeah, there were some clear warning signs. But she was so good at what she did. I mean, people when they're in addiction are good at manipulating. And so I wanted to believe her stories, so I bought him hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
Like I didn't mean to get drunk and blah blah. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Everything seems so reasonable and so
Yeah.
logical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, she's so it's there was a lot of warning signs, but so when she had that vape business, she was supposed to have left in January to go to a training session for horseback riding in Florida, because the level at which she and her sister were riding there wasn't just wasn't available in Texas, and her sister was already in Florida, so she'd asked to go, but then I found the vape business and said no. And I said, but if you can demonstrate that you can change your behavior, then you can go to the next one in May. So yeah, true to fashion, she's getting straight A's, holding a job, doing everything, and proving that she was could could live life. Well, I didn't even know that she was working at a restaurant and getting drugs behind the scene, but she was so good at what she did
Yeah.
and wasn't super far in her addiction that she was managing it all.
Yeah.
But then when it got to Florida, it ramped up big time. And so anyway, yeah, so lots of signs, but I was just as sick as she was. I just manifested it itself differently.
Yeah, again, there's that generational piece and also like these things not happening in
Yep.
isolation. But then also, as you say, a divorce being very catalyzing for kids in terms of like what coping mechanism are you going to choose
Yep.
to navigate
Yeah.
this? Yeah. I also was curious, you had mentioned previously about finding the mission within through the wife of a SEAL
Hmm.
that you worked with. This will become relevant a little bit later, but were you already plugged into a community of wives of vets at that point?
Mm-mm. No. No, Natalie was the first, and it was interesting. Um, well, we can get to that later, but yeah, no, I was not. I did not have a support group of military wives or retired wives or anything.
Did you have experience with people who were veterans before and know kind of what Devin might have been dealing with or kind of like the experiences or symptoms that somebody with his background might have?
Um, a little bit. We had been involved. There was a organization called the Xena Project that in the Richmond, Houston area, and so Devin and I both volunteered with them, and so I did have a lot of familiarity with it. But when we were involved with them, Devin was still so good at hiding it. I it didn't occur to me that he was one of them,
Yeah.
so to speak, and so I was grateful for that knowledge so that as he started to break, I was aware of where it was coming from. But yeah, I was grateful for that knowledge, but I definitely didn't think it applied to him.
Yeah. Where did his traumatic brain injury come from?
So there's not a specific instance like my friend's husband. Um, there were lots of things over his career as a SEAL, but he had like shrapnel in the head, right? Like so
Yeah.
he had. But as she described the effects of a TBI, I was recognizing that in Devon a little bit, but it was through Warrior Health Foundation. So the restaurant where we both worked, um, the owner is like absolutely loves the military, and so Natalie helped connect the Warrior Health with the restaurant, and we did a fundraiser. When Sean Rosario came and spoke, and they had the fundraiser there, I was like, "Oh my gosh!" And Devin came with me, even though I was double dipping. I was working the event and I was participating. And when Devin listened to the symptoms of a TBI, he was like, "I think I have a TBI." And what we came to learn through Warrior Health and talking to other people is that the continual concussive blast, especially with the pituitary gland and the shaking of the brain, even in training, can create TBI.
Yeah.
And so some of these guys that were being diagnosed with PTSD that weren't showing any improvement, and some of that was the VA's method, and some of it was because they needed a dual diagnosis. They had two things going on at the same time. Um, and so when, the more educated we got, the more he understood that a lot of what he was dealing with was a traumatic brain injury. And that was a kind of a first glimmer of hope for him, because he was like, well, maybe this is fixable. Because he'd become, as I'd said before, resigned to the fact that this wasn't going to change. And they've gone on to now the Warrior Health calls it operator syndrome.
Yeah.
And so it's because it's more complicated than just a TBI. But it was I'll be forever grateful for Sean and his research and his team, because they help thousands of people a year, because of their research and their hormone, and they're not in the psychedelic community. It's hormone replacement and different supplements and things like that to reboot the pituitary gland and testosterone and just different things within the internal system.
So, what was the actual path to both Davin's first experience and your first experience?
Yeah. So, all of these factors that we've talked about, all of the history, gave me my coping mechanisms and being in survival mode. And I was still in survival mode. And I was 100% focused on my family, right? Like I wasn't, I wanted to change my behavior. Like when I told you, I knew I'd contributed, I was looking to see how I could stop hurting others, how I could stop creating an environment where my daughter would feel like she needed to cope with drugs, or my other daughter coping with control. My youngest coping with friendships and people. What was I doing? What was the common denominator? My husband needing to cope with weed, because even though he had PTSD and TBI, I still felt like I was contributing to him not being able to be stable. But it was still on, how can I change my behavior so these people can be fine, right? Because I'm raging codependent. Um, so I started, but like I had said before, and in my first marriage, and he was crazy, and I'd started writing stuff down to see if I was crazy. I knew Devin wasn't crazy, unequivocally. I mean, he had demonstrated his heart was and is so pure. I mean, he wanted nothing more than to be a wonderful husband, a wonderful father, contributing to society. It was his heart's desire, and it was absolutely breaking him apart that he couldn't function the way he wanted. So I want to be very careful when I started cataloging Devin. It was for totally different reasons. But I'm like, he's got to see this. And part of the reason I cataloged is because he's so evidence-based. He was in the military, but his degree is aerospace engineering. So that level of like cataloging of information. And so I just started paying attention to patterns. And I would love to say that I was gentle and gracious about the way I communicated it sometimes, but I was less than patient sometimes. And but I still at that time had no vocabulary for feelings or emotions. And so anything that made me uncomfortable, I needed to get away from. So anyway, I started cataloging it, and Devin was not impressed with my system. But finally, let me pause there. So simultaneously, I was creating the system, but because of Cornerstone and the parents being in a recovery community, um, and the 12 steps really made me take an honest look at, did I really believe that I wasn't in control? Did I really, really, really believe that? Um, and so really, that was my first time to take a deep breath and go, I can be okay if everybody else isn't. And okay. And so I got very comfortable. Very is an exaggeration. I'm very comfortable now, but at the time I got comfortable with, I didn't care if Devin lost his shit. Sorry. But it was like, okay, if he gets mad, he gets mad. Or if Emerson's unhappy with me, it's okay. Or if Audrey or anybody else, okay. So I was starting to gain momentum in being okay if my world wasn't okay.
And also, it seems like gaining acceptance for not having to manage other people's emotions.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep. Like not my job.
Yeah.
And so I can speak truth. So kind of all of my pieces started coming together. My need for truth, my need for understanding, and, and the need for healing, things were starting to converge. But again, it was still the heart of it, if I'm honest, at that moment was still because I wanted to help other people. Um, and so as all of these things, as I continued to get more stable and less reactionary, um, and then track things, Devin, he came to me one day and was like, you have all the evidence and I have none. And he had really, which I applaud him, had been able to step out of himself and look at the information I'd been giving him and go, okay, this is what I'm doing isn't working. And that's when he finally decided to call Martine and pursue psychedelics.
So, what did that first experience look like in terms of the schedule of medicines?
Yeah. Um, he in schedule, do you mean like timeline or schedule like what he took?
What he took.
So that was going to be that trip was ibogaine and the toad 5-MeO DMT.
Also, we should point out about how the mission within works in terms of how you actually go about having these experiences legally.
Yes, no, 100%. Like all of it was done above board and not in the U.S. And lots of preparation work beforehand and afterwards, but absolutely above board and you know hopefully someday people won't have to leave the U.S. to get help. But
Well, yeah, that's more what I mean is like how they're able to do that. So you fly to California, right? Because that's where the SEAL headquarters is. Is that
um, think more going to California is about the entry point into Central America, into Mexico.
right?
Yeah.
So you travel across the border
Yep.
to have these
Exactly.
experiences legally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you fly into San Diego and drive across, and that's just because it's way easier than flying into Mexico. It was it's just logistically you don't have to rent a car or anything in Mexico. So yeah, you just fly to California and then drive down as a group. So
And then also, from what I know about the mission within, it was started by the Capones, who Marcus is a no.
mm-mm. That's Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions.
Got it.
Yep.
Apologies.
No. It's because the two were very intertwined for a long time. So it's the waters were pretty muddy, and it very well could be. And look, that Marcus's first treatment was with the Mission Within,
Gotcha.
but their organization is Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions.
Right.
And then they partnered for a long time with the Mission Within, and so they've now on different trajectories, same heart, same mission, but no pun intended. But they're doing going about it on their own right now.
So what I do know about the mission within is that mostly it catered to SEALs
Mm-hmm.
initially. If I'm remembering correctly, Devin was Air Force,
Army.
Army. How was he, or what was the screening process like to get accepted into the program?
Yeah, and that is actually part of why he didn't look. He used as an excuse. He was like, "Well, I'm not a SEAL." And if you guys ever visit, I don't want to tell his story, but that was part of his deal. He was like, "I'm not as messed up as the SEALs. Like those guys did a whole nother level." And he's special forces. He's a ranger, but he just felt like I I'm not like they're a different category.
Yeah.
And at the time, um, it was his understanding that scholarships were only available for SEALs. But the SEAL that put him in contact with Martine said, you should look at it. There's probably more scholarships available than you think. But Devin dismissed it, right? It was an excuse, not he just wasn't ready. It wasn't his time. So, but when it was his time, he contacted Martine and there was not a scholarship available, not because he wasn't a SEAL, but because the funding wasn't available for a trip anytime soon. Um, and but Martine, I absolutely love his heart. He said, what can you do? And he met my husband where he was, because he could tell that it was a situation that was pretty critical. Um, and so he applied, he filled out all the paperwork and got approved. And there's a lot of medical history you've got to give in order to go, and your medications and all of that. So there's an extensive application process, because they need to know where you are
Yeah.
before you take these medicines. But there wasn't an application process as far as scholarship, because it wasn't available.
Yeah. Yeah, because the medications are important because of the contraindications
Yep.
with things like SSRIs,
Hmm.
stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and Devin was one of the first non-SEAL guys to go down, one of the non-team guys to go down with a mission with him.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this, and I'm hoping that I do get to talk to somebody within the foundation at some point, because the choice of medicines has always been very curious to me, because ibogaine especially is very extreme. Like
Hmm.
it is at the extreme end of like how, say, pleasant these experiences are.
Yeah.
And then also 5-MeO, like again, like a very intense entry point
Yep.
to psychedelics. And the other thing that I find fascinating about this is that they're using it to treat TBI,
Hmm.
which again is very, at least for me, very unexpected, because I think of my own experiences with psychedelics, and things like psilocybin. You think of them treating psychological factors, and yet there is this pathway to healing these physical factors, or
Hmm.
these neurological factors that I really did not expect. I was very surprised when I found out that this was the treatment schedule that they
Yeah.
were using.
No, and it's and Devin, I do hope y'all get to talk, because he's a detail. Like I'm a broad global thinker, and he could give you all of the details as to why. But it's my understanding that because of the way it washes the neural pathways, is why ibogaine specifically. And I know that Martine had a lot of background with ibogaine and drug addiction, and I think specifically heroin.
Yeah.
And it, that's one of, I hate to use the word success, but one of the more consistent successful responses to getting out of heroin addiction has been ibogaine,
Yeah.
because of the way heroin affects the neural pathways, and then the way that ibogaine washes it. And then if I remember correctly, part of the roots of the ibogaine, no pun intended, was in Africa. The warriors had to do an ibogaine flood before they could come back into camp.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so these men would, in fighting back, in ancient times, was hand to hand combat, right? Like it wasn't like it is today, where it seems to be detached. It's not detached, but it was, so they had to go and sit in ceremony and sit and wash their neural pathways so that they could come back and be a functioning part of society. So it's been used a long time in warrior situations,
Mm,
but it's my understanding it has a lot to do specifically with how it washes over those neural pathways. And as you well know, it's not a magic bullet.
yeah.
You can go and do a treatment, and if you don't work to integrate, you'll go back to where you are. And I've seen people be worse. And so it is a tool and it is a pathway, but it's really the work afterwards that is really critical. But yeah, I know that Devin and Martine, and I could definitely connect you with other people that have some very detailed information as to why the iboga root works so well.
Yeah, I mean, something that you mentioned there, and we will get to the whole integration piece as it relates to this part of your life a little bit later. But this is one of the things that I have been frustrated by, or maybe just really unhappy about. And particularly as it comes to the veteran content in terms of talking about the psychedelic therapy, the efficacy seems undeniable, but there does not seem to be enough emphasis on the integration piece. It really is just pushed very frequently as this magic bullet and like, hey, you just have to take the pill and everything is fixed. But really, that is the springboard for the journey starting,
Yep.
not where you complete your journey.
No, 100%. And I had no idea that it wasn't normal for integration to be a part of these experiences until recently. I mean, because I came into the psychedelic community um, under vets and under the Mission Within, and they're phenomenal about the prep work, the integration, and then the support. I mean, both organizations have weekly calls that you can be on. So not only is part of your process to have one-on-one integration, but then they have support groups that you could be on a call 3 times a week, 4 times a week actually, if you wanted to be, and continual support. And I thought that was normal. Um, excuse me. And but I went, the more I pursue my work as a coach, the more I'm finding out, one, people are just experimenting with this on their own, just crazy to me. Um, but the other is that some of these churches, that's how you can serve some of it in the US legally. It's not part of it.
Yeah.
They'll mention, oh, don't just leave what you've learned here, make sure that you apply what you've learned. But if you don't have any context for integration, you don't know what they mean. And I went to this wonderful place last weekend, the weekend before Thanksgiving, and wonderful, safe place. And they absolutely know what they're doing with medicine. I mean, it was a beautiful ceremony. And if someone asked me about it, I would recommend it. I'm not going to mention it today because I don't want it to come across in a negative light or mention the name. But if I didn't know what they were saying as far as don't just be hearers, be doers, make sure you go home and apply what you're learning. These women, as I asked questions, especially to my roommate, like, hey, do you have anybody set up to help you integrate? And she was like, what's integration? Do you have
Yeah.
anybody to help you set up transition from plant medicine to real world again? And she was like, and she had no idea what I was talking about. And that was common with most of the women there. They just had no clue. And I don't fault the church where I was so much as yeah, I don't know. It's just to your point, it's a really, really key component of this that we're going to open another can of worms. It's gonna end up being no different than the SSRIs or antidepressants. If we just throw psychotics and other entheogens at
Yeah.
people, the problem isn't going to get solved. I mean, more will get solved because it opens up part of your mind that, some people are just going to heal. But for goodness sakes, I came back in such a dark spot after psilocybin that if I hadn't had an integration coach, who knows how long? I mean, I'm a survivor and I'm determined to heal, but I was grieving for the first time in my life. And 40 something, that's a lot of grieving. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if there is one thing that I would change about the space right now, it's that I would put more emphasis on the integration piece.
Yeah.
And I mean, even from everything I've heard, it seems like Mission Within and vets put a lot of emphasis on integration. But from what I see from people who have gone through it, they maybe it's because it's not the sexy part, or like the actual psychedelic part feels so profound, and then this is much slower and low key, that it doesn't register as much. But for me, it's inverted, that the integration is the work,
Hmm.
and without it there's no real progress.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I mean, and it is, you're exactly right. It is the harder work, you know? So, I mean, it's because there's a lot in the weekend, but it's not until you start connecting those dots that it's like, oh, wow, okay. This is, this isn't fun, but it is fun because then you feel way better after you've unearthed it.
Yeah. How did things start to change for Devin following his first experiences?
Right off the bat, he had a tolerance for things that he didn't have before. I mean, for instance, like, and hindsight's 2020. I love integration now and have a huge heart for it, and actually, like that's started sort of becoming my life's work. But it's he came home, and I had this expectation that he would understand me and he would understand what was important to me. And we were supposed to go somewhere, and bless him. I mean, he'd been home from Ibogaine like 48 hours, and it was a lot of people, and it was talking and sharing. Um, and I was like, well, and I think he had a call. And I was like, well, if you loved me, you would want to do that. And like, he, which is super unfair of me to say, but his ability to weather that, like that he didn't absolutely lose his mind and come unglued and he got agitated, but he was able to process it and then later come back to me and go, "I'm sorry I misunderstood you."
Right.
I was like, "Who are you?" Like what just happened, right? And so right off the bat, his ability to have space for me, and for me to factor in, and he'd wanted to, like he was doing his best before, but that didn't end up in a fight, and not only did it not end up in a fight, but it ended up in him having some awareness of what I needed,
Yeah.
was huge, which then led eventually that was part of my unraveling. Um, but yeah, he fortunately, I'm so grateful. He was determined not to go backwards, and so he did the integration. I mean, made sure he was on calls. He made sure that he worked with his integration coach. I mean, um, he really didn't want to go backwards. And he also didn't want to become dependent on the medicine. That was a big fear of his and mine. It was like, okay, this is great, but if we're going to have to keep doing all this all over again, then we, might as well be smoking weed,
Yeah.
right? But I've learned very quickly that that's not how this works. Um, so yeah,
I am curious about that. I mean, I can relate to that sentiment of not wanting to go backwards, and I identify with a lot of the ways that you have described Devin's approach to coping. It, I mean, definitely in my case, and with a lot of people I know who have started psychedelics, things have to get a lot worse before they get better because you have to unravel those coping mechanisms. Even though you're committed to moving forward. Did he end up sliding backwards unintentionally?
absolutely. I mean, in that it's just how it is, right? Like life is not an upward
Yeah.
trajectory, right? And I was grateful that not only did his integration coach explain that to me, but vets, in Mission Within at the time had, and the call's still going on, it's just vets now, but a support call for wives of veterans who'd gone through the medicine that hadn't done the medicine. So your question earlier, Natalie was my only point of contact until then. But then once Devin went through the medicine, I had a support group every week. And I gained a whole world of support that I'd never in my life had. Um, and so on those calls, they explain, I mean, just some of the women that had been in that space a lot longer, and Amber, explaining that this is going to be up and down and up and down. So I had a frame of reference. And in those calls, they were giving us tools. And I found myself in familiar territory because the calls weren't about bashing our husbands. They were about how do you stay in your lane? How do you become healthier? How do you continue your path forward, regardless of what they're doing? And so, although it was a space where I had women who were experiencing the same thing, the point was our healing. And so I knew that. But what was hugely different was his ability to circle back. So that if he did, go in the wrong direction or downhill, whatever you want to say, we were always able to circle back and have productive conversation. And the gap, like what used to be, would maybe be a situation that would take a month for us to settle and resolve and, get back to some common ground, started taking 3 weeks and then 2 weeks and then 1 week and then a day. So over the course of this time, since we've started this journey of healing with psychedelics, that that turnover time has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yeah. Yeah, I refer to that as emotional agility, and
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
also something that I have experience with. Like I'm able to get to what I'm feeling a lot quicker since starting psychedelics, and like you said, that turnaround time for both internal and external resolution has shortened with each subsequent session, and it feels really good to be able to get to the root of things
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah. No, for sure.
It's also fascinating that you mention about the community of spouses who their partners go through psychedelics. That is a fascinating concept that I hadn't really thought about before, because I have personal experience with this, and I also have friends in the same situation where they start psychedelic therapy really because they need it, but their partners are either not on board with it, or they don't feel like they are in a place to do their own healing. And that creates a lot of friction because this person starts on this, like, very I want to say a very intense path of healing. Like, you're
Yeah.
really,
Intense is a good word.
yeah, like lighting the dynamite when you start on this
Yeah.
journey, and that can create a lot of challenges for the person on the other side of that. So to have this community of people who can weigh in,
Yep.
I mean, it now that I think about it, that seems like a very idyllic
Yeah.
integration community.
Yeah. No, it was critical. And what was interesting, and you kind of touched on this in a different way earlier, but what became very apparent very quickly, because most of the women with whom I was on the call were team wives. I was, because Devin was one of the first non-team guys, I was one of the first non-team wives. So I believe every single woman was married to a team guy. The majority of them were married during their deployments. But what was interesting is their experience of being married through the deployments and the ups and downs with that and that cycle was a mirror image of my marriage to my first husband. And so, although Josh wasn't going on deployments, that cycle and being in the survival mode manifested in almost exactly the same way. And so I had common ground with these women on being in survival mode, because every woman on that call is in survival mode. Like, no, nobody's nobody's in that comes to that space at first not in survival mode. But and that's part of what's launched me into I need to figure out, and maybe offline we can brainstorm, but I would love to provide a support call for people with spouses that are in healing, specifically with psychedelics, that aren't necessarily doing it themselves. And I saw the same in the recovery community. Like you said, the psychedelics speed the process up, and they just kind of light a match. But even because it was a family community in Cornerstone, I often watched husbands or wives begin the healing process, and the other spouse can't handle it.
Yeah.
And they didn't, even though they both knew their kid was in recovery, they both were coming to the meetings. You just see one spouse go that way and one go that way, or one spouse would quit coming. And so it is a very real problem on problem's probably the wrong word, but a situation of conundrum, people healing and then their partner's not,
Yeah.
because it does, one way or another, things are going to change. And I've had to work with people, or had the opportunity to work with people to reconcile, okay, this is healthy me can't be part of this human, and how that looks like, whether it's leaving them permanently or just separating for a little while, but really trying to reconcile your world of me's getting healthy and I love this person to death, but healthy me can't coexist with unhealthy him or her.
Yeah.
So it is a real problem, and it came up in our marriage. I mean, that's what led to me going to do psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, exactly like you mentioned, like, especially some of the process addictions like workaholism,
Yeah.
very socially acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that's it's totally fine to build a company and go on and be a multimillionaire, but if you
Yeah.
look at the person's life, it's just as out of control as
Yeah, or like the hardest working man in show business. Like,
yeah,
that is something to aspire to.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, and it became the American dream.
So, Devin has this very positive experience with the psychedelics, and then you're plugged into this community. What was your own entryway to starting your own psychedelic experiences?
Um, it was something that I was definitely never going to do. I'm just not. I'd use drinking to cope, but I don't like really being out of control. Um, but because Devin had all of this space for me, and I turned into somebody in a very, very short order, like a matter of 2 months, maybe, turned into a person I'd never been before. Like, I have plenty of things about my temperament and my character that are unpleasant, but I don't have a mean bone in my body. Like, I just don't. And our old ways of relating weren't working. And so, like, the way I would get attention, and not in like crazy dramatic ways. Like, I wasn't a door slammer, I wasn't a pouter, but and I can't. It's evading me right now. But that's the specific night that I decided I was going to do psychedelics. He did something, and all I wanted was to be seen and understood. And whatever I communicated to him, he was not seeing me or hearing me. And so I lost it. And like the more mad I got, the more calm he said. He just sat there Indian style in our bed and was just like smiling at me. I was like, and I went from being hurt and like that suffocated feeling, like when you don't have, like, you have no words for emotions. You're not at a point where you're ready to cope and you're just so suffocated by the way you feel that you will do whatever it takes to not feel this way. Um, and I just went off, and for the first time in my life, I started berating him, and I was like, it was like I was outside of my body watching me do this. I mean, I
Yeah.
was just mocking him and making fun of him, and like it was awful. And once I calmed down, I was like, what just happened? And fortunately, because of these calls I had, I understood that I had space for me to come out. And I was so uncomfortable. And I didn't know, like, I had a husband saying, what do you want to do? Or what would you like to do? Or how do you feel about this? And I'm like, I don't even know what you're saying. And so he had room for me to heal. And I didn't, I mean, I was, over 40 and I'd never had room to heal before. You mean you want me to step out of survival mode? And that wasn't cognitive at the time. Like, I wasn't, but I realize now that I did not know how to function outside of survival mode.
Yeah.
So that's when I was like, I looked back. It was the next couple days. I was like, okay, if he went and this healed him, then maybe, because I too had accepted that there was something in me that would never heal. Like, there was just this monkey on my back, and I just accepted that I was going to have to learn to live with whatever pain it was. I didn't know what the pain was, but I was going to have to learn to live with it.
Was that idea as explicit in your head as it was for Devin?
It started to take formation after my divorce. I There was a thought that had lingered for a while, before divorce. And when I say a while, I want to say, let's say 5 years. And it was that my mom's dad had sexually abused me, but I couldn't. That just didn't make sense to me. And it was these fleeting thoughts. Um, but my friend that helped me through my divorce also has experience with sexual abuse, and so she was listening and tracking. Anytime that subject would come up, I would get very angry about my grandfather. And I've been angry about my mom's dad since I can remember. Like, you would talk about him and I would like become just instantly angry. And I just dismissed it like as a kid. But then when I divorced, all of a sudden I unequivocally knew I had been sexually abused by my mom's dad.
Mm.
But I still was like, this can't be right because I don't remember.
Yeah.
But then I went to my friend Kayleen and I was like, I think this happened. And she was like, I know it happened. And she like backtracked on conversations. And I was really grateful. She was like, this is some of your behavior and some of the way you talk. Anyway, but I told my parents, and my dad, bless him, um, looked at me and said, I'm concerned you're making this up to get attention after your divorce.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And he's since apologized. But my mom, I don't know that my mom believes me to this day. But for her to believe me would be to accept her abuse.
Yeah.
Um,
And also just to engage with that idea.
yeah, no, it's so hard. And again, my mom is doing the very, very best that she can do.
Yeah.
And my mom has survived by sweeping pain under the rug. And I've survived by pulling it out.
Yeah.
And so anyway, it wasn't, but I just, by this time I was working with a psychologist who was a trauma psychologist, but yeah, I was just trying to not, yeah, that tangent. And so I knew I had had a session with that psychologist that I didn't remember. She, and this will become relevant in a minute, but it was towards the end of the session, and she talked about doing a meditation exercise, and I just slipped into a whole nother realm, which, is another conversation. But, as we've said, plant medicine isn't the only solution, and it's a tool, and it's actually not a solution. It's just a gateway. And plenty of people can get healing through breath work, meditation. Like it is, um, there's so many other avenues. But so anyway, apparently we had a whole other session. And then the next week when I came back, she said, we have a lot to talk about after last week. And I said, what are you talking about? And she realized that I had no recollection of that session.
Yeah.
And to this day, I don't know. I should go ask her. She said she would tell me when I'm ready, just because it was your brain only lets you know what you're ready for, your psyche, right? And so my psyche obviously wasn't ready for me to be cognitively aware.
Yeah.
So anyway, all of that to say, I didn't expect to heal. And I just expected to feel broken the rest of my life. But Devin came back so happy that I was like, well, I'll give it a try. Yeah.
What was the process like for you getting accepted to that? Had they started to do the process with other spouses
hmm
before that? Yeah.
Yeah. I think they'd been doing the process for spouses for 3 years, maybe four at that point, but they had been doing the process for spouses. And that's what, a pause here, I will say one really cool thing about Amber and Marcus' story is that she's never done psychedelics. She's never,
Interesting.
yeah. And so her healing has been 100% outside of that community. So that's a really, really cool story, and just a great testimony to two different two different modalities, and within, in their marriage, and in their lives. But so I pretty once I'm pretty decisive. Like once I decide to do something, I do it. So I called Martine in very short order, but there wasn't, um, the timing wouldn't line up. Like I was at that point managing a restaurant, and really I was running the weekends, and so getting away on a weekend um, was going to be hard. And I was still choosing my kid. Like I didn't want to be gone. I didn't want to miss anything of my kids. So I was like, if I have a weekend away from my family, it's or a weekend away from the work, it's going to be with my family. Um, and so it just things weren't aligning. And then, which again, in hindsight, is just excuses, right? It's just me avoiding having to really dig deeper. But then Martine called, and in April, end of April, mid to end, and it's like, I have a spot opening up on Mother's Day weekend. Or he didn't say Mother's Day, it was May 7th. He said, do you want to go? And I looked at it and I was like, well, it's Mother's, I said, that's Mother's Day weekend. Are you sure you have it right? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, well, okay, I'll do it, which is so against my grain. Um, but goes back to, risky moves are better impulsively for me. If I have to think about a risky move, I probably won't do it. I'm just better to do it. Um, and so I did not have, I maybe had a week between agreeing to go and going down. But I'm really grateful to the Mission Within because they were adamant that I still do prep calls,
Yeah.
with an integration coach. And so I did. I did 2 prep calls with an integration coach, and went in kind of blind, thinking, well, Devin did it and it's safe, and he trusts these people. And one of the guys that was going to be facilitating our weekend was down on his weekend, and it's like, well, if Devin trusts this guy, then I'll trust this guy. And again, going back to this male protector, like, oh, these men have it, it'll be fine. Um, and so I went, yeah, agreed to go down, and really just kind of went full force ahead and didn't even really think through anything too much about like the what ifs. Um, but yeah, and set an intention. One of the big things, about the medicine work for therapy, is setting intention, and it can be a slippery slope. Intention can become expectations. So you have to be
Right.
very careful. But my integration coach or prep coach, whatever, was like, well, I'd love for you just to set one intention. And I'm like, Katie, I don't know. She's like, I just want to be 5 again. And just blurted, like, it's just what came to mind. And she was like, okay. Well, little did I know that meant all hell breaking loose. So anyway, so yeah, I kind of went in impulsively, but trusting the process because it had worked for Devin.
Yeah. Again, same question as for Devin. Like, what was your schedule for your trip?
So for the spouses, it was psilocybin with MDMA, so they're served at the same time, and then the 5-MeO DMT after that.
Is there any rationale or explanation given to that? Like it is because those are generally considered milder psychedelics. Is it because they don't expect spouses to have the same set of physical factors that the men are suffering with?
Yep.
Okay.
And there are, I mean, obviously, there's plenty of women that have done the ibogaine, and some women um, after psilocybin have gone and done the ibogaine. But yeah, it's the healing that needs to be done is more in line with the psilocybin MDMA route. Um, and I mean, as crazy as it sounds, but you've been in this space, you get it. They call to you, like it's one of those things where, yes, there is an inclination, and yes, people like Martine and other people that provide this space, um, can look at you and go, okay, I think ibogaine might be best for you or psilocybin. But the reality is, nobody can make that decision for you other than yourself. And so, but yeah, specifically, they are just a set of problems that wives come with, lend themselves more to the psilocybin and MDMA.
Can you describe the environment or process that the MDMA and psilocybin ceremony takes place under?
Um, so there's a house that they have down in Mexico, and yeah, we all flew to San Diego and then drove down, and it definitely felt very safe. They were very good about making sure that there were proper safety protocols as far as crossing the border. Um, and then in the house, it was living kind of typical house as far as living room, dining room, and it was set up like someone's home. It wasn't set up like a clinic. It wasn't like they used a house and then gutted it and it felt clinical. It was just very homey and safe. And but then all of the women, there were 6 of us, all sleep in the same room. And so the room where you do the journey work as well as sleeping was all in the same room. And so we just went and got moved in and got our stuff situated. And then there was, the first evening that we're there, just getting to know each other and, some ceremony work, some meditation work, some breath work to just kind of come and be present. And I had no context for it, or didn't know what they were saying. They were going to do ceremony. I'm like, I have no idea what they meant. And with the plant medicines, I've come to understand the respect for the nature and respect for and gratitude for them is a whole part of the process. Just like we opened this with gratitude, just starting things with gratitude changes so much. And so something that was super foreign not gratitude wasn't foreign to me, but ceremony. I didn't understand that. But then the next morning, I guess we got there on a Thursday. And then Friday we did the psilocybin during the day. And that was in that context, there was plenty of staff and plenty of people there for support. Part of the reason for keeping it small is if each person struggled within their journey, there was someone to be with them. I should back up. We all had to do uh, uh, EKG and we had blood pressure taken, but then we were hooked up to heart monitors. Like we were checked out medically,
Yeah.
not just our medical history, but we're checked out. And it didn't happen on my weekend, but I do know that there have been people that haven't been cleared to do the medicine because their um, body's just not in a place to do it, which I really, really appreciated that. And the people still could participate in the weekend as far as the breath work and meditation, just not the medicine. Um, and the journey, yeah, so I took a lot of support during the journey. It was difficult. Um,
Can
and
I ask, are you guys all in the same room
mhm,
as you're doing this?
yep.
Okay.
But there was, I was having such a hard time, and apparently moving someone else was easier than moving me. So I was, as I said earlier, I'm a verbal processor, and I warned them that I was a verbal processor. But when you're in the medicine space, as you know, your eye shades and earphones. You're supposed to go inward. Well, all of my inward was coming outward, and so I was disturbing other people's space. Um, and it all works together. I mean, that's a whole nother tangent because some of the stuff that I was processing helped other people, but then this woman went in another room because my processing was interfering with her processing.
Right.
So that was another thing. They're equipped to be able to meet different needs, and be able to for people to be in their process in an environment that is most productive for them.
Do you guys record the audio of your sessions or no?
No, no, not in that context.
Yeah, I assume in a group setting it
Exactly.
would introduce some
Um,
concerns.
but I was fortunate enough to have someone transcribe my whole thing.
Mm.
And so she, yeah, I took so much attention that she just got out her journal and just started writing. And a lot of it was for my benefit. But she also, anyway, so that was Friday, and I was in such a bad spot. I was so grateful to just eat fruit and stuff because your diet down matters as well when you're on the medicine and just being able to metabolize it, as you know. And then Saturday was kind of just a reflection and um, processing day, and we went to the beach and just tried to just breathe. And then the next day was the 5-MeO. And I was in such a bad spot. I was like, there's no way I'm doing any more plant medicine, any entheogen ever again. Um, and they did such a phenomenal job because it was very clear that it was my choice. Nobody was going to force me to do anything.
Yeah.
But they were so well equipped and so good at what they do that they were able um, to help me get to a spot that I wanted to do the 5-MeO. And I'm so grateful I did because it was like, I'm, if I did it again, I might have a different experience, but I was like, I do 5-MeO over psilocybin any day of the week,
Right.
based on my first experience. So that's how, and then you finish out that day and then go home on Monday morning. So in the 5-MeO, I should make sure to say that is done one at a time in a different room. And so in that process, they say could take the whole day. They don't hurry anybody in their process. Um, and so they have all hands on deck for the 5-MeO.
Yeah.
And which now that I know and understand more about medicine, I think is just a brilliant way. I love the way they navigated the weekend between group activity, group therapy, and one-on-one versus. I mean, it was just very professionally done.
Can I ask about the first day? You said you do psilocybin and MDMA. Are those done at the same time or subsequently?
Simultaneously, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you did the pill and then drank the tea, or drank the tea and take it. It doesn't matter. But yes, they're done simultaneously. Um, and and the thought behind that is a little bit to hopefully with the heart softener, just to soften. I can't imagine what psilocybin would have been like without the MDMA, for me. But who knows? Maybe if I separated them, um, which I will do. I look forward to, but have not done them separately yet. But yeah,
If you are open to sharing about it, what was that first experience like?
yeah, it was so hard. It was lots of wrestling, lots of things that I was afraid to look at, which was really interesting. And so like it, there was a lot of fear of letting go,
Yeah.
and I feel like at the time I thought I was letting go. In hindsight, I was still fighting the medicine like hell. But it was lots of Like, I don't see in any of the medicine I have done, I don't see concrete things. Like, some people will say, I revisited childhood and I saw myself, on the playground, blah, 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 blah. I don't. Like, I would see lines of colors and dots, and it was, I mean, which is very typical for people too, but it was all aligned with the music. Um, and then it was interesting. I saw these like burlesque women that were cartoony, but whatever they represented was so horrifying to me. I couldn't look at. Like, I was like having a panic attack about whatever they represented, and it was just a very sexual experience, to be honest. Like, a lot of sexual trauma um, came up, but it never ended up making sense. And that's Cynthia was transcribing different scenes, like my parents with sex edu. I pause. That was the one cognitive, like one physical thing I saw. Um, my parents thought that the best way to do sex education for us was to put a National Geographic thing on for my brother and I.
Right.
And my brother Luke is like 18 months younger than I am. Um, and they put us under this table in the living room, or I don't, yeah, or that's what it came out in treatment, in the journey, that we were under this table with this little TV watching it.
Do you remember what age you were at that time?
No, nope, no, um, we were little enough to get under the table.
Right.
Like, like little enough. Like, I was sitting in the style. My brother Luke was sitting with his hands up. Um, but something went wrong there, and I don't know. Like, but it was like lots of stuff about my mom, and my mom knowing, and my mom not believing me, and lots and lots of pain about that, that was rooted in sexual pain, but not anything concrete other than the sex ed on TV. But it, yeah, it was a really interesting. I had a line of thought, and it might come back to me, but oh, the other part was very much about I was choosing to be there. Like, I remember saying, "Can I untake this medicine?"
Yeah.
Like, can I undo this? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay. But went back through my processes of, and even working with that trauma psychologist that I was telling you about. She's phenomenal, because I'd had a session with her before I went as well, and just walking through, and she knew me well enough. She was like, and fortunately, she has a little bit of training with psychedelics. And she said, for the way your brain has processed safety, which you and I talked about a little bit offline, she
Yeah.
was like, you aren't going to feel safe unless you feel like you have chosen to do this. And of course, she didn't tell me that. She helped me get to that realization, but helped me really go in with a concrete understanding. I chose to be here. I wanted to be here. I wanted this. Um, and it was that I was able to really lean in a little bit and not suffocate. But that feeling I described earlier, like, I just truly thought that I was going to suffocate and die. What psilocybin was showing me. Um, but remember, like, throughout my journal, if you go back and look at it, it was like, I love my kids. I chose to be a mom. I chose to be here. And so a lot about owning the life that I had, and owning the things that I had chosen. Um, but it was, I really, really wrestled with the medicine. There was lots of purging, which is not uncommon. But my hands kept, it was really, really interesting. They, not seizing would be, but curling up, like almost like I'd have it be having a hand spasm.
Yeah.
And I would consciously have to be just opening my hand. Um, and then another thing was like, I, I got out of the medicine and I was like, Cynthia, please tell me I didn't do anything wrong. And unraveling that, throughout my integration process ended up being pretty important, because the connection with that is the psychologist that I've, Dr. Dunbar, who's just unbelievable, that I was working with, that helped me, with trauma and with the prepping a little bit. Um, when I had that session with her that I don't remember, the thing that was most important to me after the next time I saw her, when I found out that I told her stuff that I didn't remember, was that I hadn't done anything wrong. And so then that was a connection. And my psilocybin journey was, please tell me I just didn't do anything wrong. And so it was an interesting parallel that took time to unravel. But um, yeah, it was really, and music was driving me crazy. Like the music, I was like, I gotta make this stop. I was like, this is not working for me. Which is also part of, yeah, as you know, like it's intentional, and the playlist and the way
Yeah.
it's set is very intentional.
Yeah.
So
Can I dig into that statement real quick about not doing anything wrong? Do you mean from like a place of perfectionism, or what you voiced was not like morally wrong?
what I voiced was morally wrong. Like I done something to hurt somebody, had I done something, and it was in later work. It's tied back to the sexual trauma of from my grandfather, and so and there is more, and that's what I realized is I was hoping that psilocybin, like Devin got some concrete uh, data points as far as where some of the PTSD was from, so where some of his like the roots of his stuff, and I didn't get any concrete data point. What I got was freedom. That monkey was off my back. I didn't care that I didn't know anymore, which was better, right? What good does it know to do to know your data point if you don't have freedom from it?
Yeah.
So I got freedom from it, but it's I've come to understand that whatever happened, I felt responsible for, which is not uncommon with sexual trauma, especially in
Absolutely.
children.
Yeah.
And so it was this, and I had this fear that I had hurt Emerson, which was correlated with the drugs. Like, had I done something to make her do this? And I had known cognitively, plenty of people grow up in worse situations than my kids grew up in and don't do drugs.
Yeah.
It's a choice, but it's not. I still just need, like, from the core of who I was, like, did I hurt these people? Um, and was just free from that burden. Like I just wanted to throw up at the thought of, did I do something wrong? And really working on, and let's say I had done something grievous, which to my knowledge I haven't. To nobody else's knowledge, that I've not done that. But understanding that your past is part of who you are,
Yeah.
and that even if you had, it was part of what you needed in order to get here. And it doesn't excuse any behavior. It doesn't make it okay in the sense of, like, yes, things hurting other people isn't okay, but every single thing feeds into where you are and has a point and has a purpose. And instead of looking at things are good and bad and in right and wrong, looking at it like, what do I learn from this? And don't
Yeah.
get me wrong, there are right and wrongs. Like, you can't kill a person. So I'm not throwing out morality, but if we can reframe, that was one blessing that the psilocybin gave me, of like reframing it from the shame and the guilt to having gratitude for that part of it, so that because that's who I am today, or I wouldn't be who I am without that. So I didn't get any concrete answer. I just got a relief from the pain.
Yeah. And it sounds like also finding grace in that
Yeah.
situation was, and like this is, I mean, it's something that I've struggled with, but also I find it is something that people really have trouble understanding or connecting to. When I talk about finding forgiveness for my abusers, people are like, people feel very, very strongly about child abuse.
Yep.
And, like they're like, oh, people who hurt children, like worst people on earth, like they should all be put to death. And there is this disconnection between the idea that forgiving somebody is not excusing their
Yep.
actions. Like there is no, I don't think there's any argument to be made that would ever make the actions that I was hurt by okay.
Right.
But the forgiveness and the grace for the abuser, I mean, the forgiveness is for me, but it's also like understanding that they had their own set of adverse experiences that led them to express that in that way.
Yep.
And, they are also a product in the same way, like kind of like you said, finding gratitude for the way that your own adverse experiences molded you into the person you are today. Like my abuse molded me into a person who expresses some things in unhealthy ways. They had that same experience, but in just a much more malevolent way. And
Yep.
and realizing like there is just a spectrum there, and unfortunately some people fall on the extreme or like really awful part of that, and like
Yeah.
just having like understanding for those dynamics at play.
Yep.
It has at least allowed me to make peace with it, to
Yeah.
to understand that more logically, and like understand the process by which somebody gets there.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, it's like, and that's what's amazing. Like, is there still like a hurt there? Yeah. I mean, because I think that I don't know, maybe there are people that say pains go away. I think you learn to appreciate them um, in a different way, but I don't know if they go away. But I can speak about my grandfather now without hatred.
Yeah.
And I had a excuse me, interesting experience with someone that didn't know me at all, but one of my friends had said, "Hey, this woman got some information about you." She was like, she you came to mind, and she wanted to share what came to mind. Like, okay, um, and I should back up. So my friend asked permission. She said, "Could I share a little bit about you to this other person?" And I said yes, but what she was sharing had nothing to do with my childhood trauma and my grandfather. So anyway, this woman asked if she could call and share what had shown up for her when she was thinking about me. And I'm like, sure, and it just was super interesting. And I was like, this woman's got to be crazy, right? Like, I'm thinking, this is whatever, but I'm curious. Um, and she proceeded to map out some things about me and my pain and in my childhood that nobody could have known had I not talked to them. But she said, there's this really interesting thing. She said, I have this old man telling me that he needs your forgiveness and your blessing before he can move on.
Huh.
Yeah, and it was really interesting, and that's a whole nother conversation as far as like it made me think about purgatory in a whole nother way because I've kind of always dismissed purgatory, but the stuff she was saying couldn't be made up. And that's a whole nother spiritual conversation as far as reconciling that. But there was no doubt in my mind she was describing my grandfather, and I was like, absolutely, I forgive him, and I release him to go and do. Um and she said, it's just this man came in brokenhearted, and he said, I'm sorry I hurt you. And he said, I hurt you because I was hurt. And so to your point, like that's, it was, and who knows? I mean, who knows how all that works? And that might be a whole nother podcast. But it was very, very interesting because she would have no way of knowing that my grandfather did that, but needing that forgiveness. And I had forgiven him, but for whatever reason, in some other cosmic level, he needed to know that I forgave him. And even the release I had from that, like being like, yeah, of course, like I appreciate it, but like you said, understanding, and I knew, I mean, abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, a car wreck, okay, but like childhood traumas, things that, like the way my mom raised me, it didn't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And she's doing the best she could based on the environment she grew up in. So you're right, the forgiveness and the grace is a huge, huge part of it.
Yeah. So then onto your 5-MeO experience. What was that like? And I have very little context as to how that experience goes, and how long it lasts, et cetera, or just even what the person's experience is with that.
Yeah. Um, it's quicker than it feels like. I know that much. Like it felt like it was like half a day, and it was hardly more than an hour. And for me, 5-MeO was fantastic. Like it was this bliss and this just like, that's where I really, really let go. Like it was just this like, almost like a surrender, like my arms, um, the hand clenching just stopped and my arms just kind of went, it was just like almost like a full surrender, just like letting go. But then, but there was also lots of pain like this. It was like this pain that didn't want to let go, and the purging that continued. But me just wanting Like, no, I'm just going to stay in the bliss. Um, and so it was a lot of really just stillness and peace. And I loved the music. Like, that's what was so funny. Like, I will find myself playing the playlist from my 5-MeO a lot.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting the way that the different, and that's, we are all frequencies and energies and all of that. And so the that just resonated with me, and I was just still. Like, I think for the first time in my life, I was still and present, and really just happy. Like, I was five again, but I was also five again because of the trauma. So that those two worlds merged because, and that's part of the integration story. But the worlds collided. That's the last time I remember being happy and carefree, and that's when my world got rocked.
Yeah.
And so I was five again, which was a blessing and a curse, because then I had to grieve that
Yeah, you had
whole
to live
thing,
on
as we
both
talked
sides
about.
of the
Yeah,
line.
yeah, yeah.
So after these experiences, and you're back to Texas,
Yeah.
how do things play out after that, and how do things start to change for you?
Um, yeah, a lot of grieving. Like, I was raw, and I was starting to feel and starting to have. I'd starting to get. I'd started to get an emotional vocabulary when we were in the recovery community, um, and just understanding. Anger is an umbrella for a lot of different things. I mean, anger. It's not really the anger; it's the disappointment or the whatever in that. But I just reconciling my worlds. Like, I don't want to say I was depressed, because I was still functioning. I was still going to work. I was, but like, everything was so raw and impact. Like, I was just like, I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried. Like, and really, that's what helped me, um, let go of so much from the past that like I said, I don't even know what I'm letting go of, but it took a lot of patience on the part of my husband, just because he came back so happy and on cloud nine, and reset in that direction. Like, for me to reset, and instead of me coming home happy, coming home and needing just a ton of support and a ton of space, and was really grateful that I was given that space. And I slipped in and out of the medicine for months. It was, I mean, the first time it happened, it freaked me out, because I had no idea what was happening, because we had my daughter over and some friends from the recovery community. I'm like, this is awesome. I don't know what's happening right now. And, but was able to get, one of the integration people on the phone, and walked me through, um, the fact that I was going back into the medicine. And so that the medicine was cool that way, because it kept giving me opportunities to let go. Like, I hadn't let go in my, in the main journey. Um, and I also, as I let go of the pain, and as I let go of that being who I was, and the guilt and shame, I started to remember, um, happy moments in my journey. And so that was really, really cool. They were little snippets, but it was, things changed. Also, in the sense that, like, I had room for people to hurt that I didn't have before,
Yeah.
myself included. And so I didn't need pain to go away, as quickly, and just being able to sit. Um, and I wasn't in, the process of not being in a survival mode had started years before, but I truly, like, I didn't need me to be in survival mode. I could, like, if I was sad, I was sad. And if I was happy, I was happy. And I didn't need to shift gears as quickly. But I'm still trying to get comfortable and happy. Is just still a weird spot, even though I pretended to be happy for so many years.
Yeah, that's what struck me, is you were intentionally distancing yourself from this perfectionism, and this, it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was, and I was afraid. I realized too, and I was so grateful that this was pointed out to me, that if I let myself grieve, that I would get stuck in grieving. And so to realize that nothing's a permanent state. And it's all got to be gone through. And what's funny is I'd done crisis pregnancy counseling. I'd done a certification for that, And I had counseled women through the grief cycle, but understanding that how my life fit into that, and that I had never completed the grief cycle, really started to play out after the psilocybin and then the 5-MeO.
Yeah. So at this point, both yourself and Devin have had these psychedelic experiences. What happens next after this? Like, you guys both do your integration, and then like, how is life different for both of you?
Um, it's way more tranquil. Like things that were just a big deal aren't a big deal anymore. And don't get me wrong, things frustrate me or upset me, um, and all of that. But it's like there's just this sense of like calmness and peace to life that there wasn't before. There's not this urgency, and there's not the panic mode, and there's not we're both able to respond instead of react, to situations, and things still get tense. I mean, things get hard for sure, and we misunderstand each other. But there's not this. I don't have this driving need to be understood in order to survive.
Yeah.
So I can like, if Devin doesn't get what I'm saying, we might get animated and frustrated, but like in the end, okay, like you do you. Like
Yeah.
I just don't. And so it's created a lot more peace, and it's also like taken the edge off of certain situations, and I'm able to advocate for myself. And when Devin listens to this, he's going to die laughing at this example. But like even as simple as a Christmas tree, we got the Christmas tree the other day, and I didn't want to do the lights all myself, right? And the old me, which I always did until a couple years ago, and Devin started helping because I asked, because he was like, I always did the lights because I was neurotic and I wanted the lights to be a certain way, and the whole tree lit up evenly. And a few years ago, I finally broke on my neuroticness and was like, "Will you please help me with the lights?" And he did a good job for the most part, but I was like, I fixed it a little and let it be. Well, this year when we got the tree and we wanted to do the lights, I just was not in the mood to do the whole tree. But he didn't feel well, and old codependent me wanting to just not rock the boat, not create any problems, would have just done it, and got it taken care of. But instead, I was like, "Hey, can we take turns? Like, can we do these lights together so that like I do a strand, you do a strand, and we both get this done together because neither of us want to do it?" And like he did. And before, I probably would have done them, but then been resentful afterwards, just in true codependency form. Or he would have like, there just would have been a problem around the situation as opposed to both of us looking at it and being like, okay, Kelly used her voice, so I need to help. And me having some sensitivity that he couldn't do them by himself because he really didn't feel good. So that sounds like a really silly solution, like example, but it really like it's a profound thing when you can navigate life and like recognize and see the person where they are,
Yeah.
as opposed from the lens of my own perspective. And I think that now that I'm sharing that, the biggest thing is that I'm okay with your perspective being your perspective. And I don't need to change. If you see a 6 and I see a 9, I would love to trade places so we could both see the other side.
Right.
But if you're unwilling to change places with me, okay.
Yeah. There is that shift away from needing the other person's validation and
Yep.
acceptance. Yeah.
Yeah. And it opened up my understanding. I have been a spiritual person since I can remember. I have loved God. I've loved spirituality. I mean, I got in trouble, but I explored like Taoism and Buddhism and stuff as a teenager, and that opening up that spiritual realm and to understand what I understood before plant medicine, and then it to just been escalated and trumped, and just me continuing to have this conversation with spiritually, with what I believe is God is really incredible. And I think that a lot of people, they don't necessarily verbalize it in the same context or with the same words I do, but you'd be hard pressed to find a person that has done any psychedelic, any plant medicine that didn't have a spiritual experience on some level.
Yeah, it's a very unexpected side effect.
Yeah.
I think people think of, I mean, at least people who are not familiar with the space, they think of it as like very hippie-ish and like, psychedelic and mind expanding and all that. But
Yep.
like, it ends up tying back to something very, very traditional and very core.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned, I guess a little more than 2 weeks ago, you had your first ayahuasca experience. I know that experience is still very fresh. So instead of asking about that, I wanted to ask, like, what is do you have a plan around psychedelics going forward, and kind of like what is your long-term outlook for psychedelics?
That's a good question. I in between the psilocybin and the ayahuasca, um, I did microdose psilocybin. I probably started microdosing psilocybin 4 months ago, but I don't do it consistently. And so on that level, like I can see myself microdosing for a while. I definitely want to do MDMA on its own. And Devin and I want to do it together. And so um, that'll be interesting to see how that forms. I get very be, because the journeys are so intense for me, and I will slip, like I said before, I slip in and out of the medicine. Um, it takes me a minute to like say, oh, I should do medicine again because it's so intense and the effects linger for so long, and
Yeah.
not the processing. Like you said something to me on the phone or Zoom. I think you said I was gonna master therapy, or I was gonna be. What did you?
Like the best at therapy, or
Yeah,
win at therapy, something to that effect.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that so resonated with me. I was like, I am going to be the best healer possible. I am going to heal to the best that anybody else has ever healed. And so I have to be careful about my intention with why I'm doing this, and not to like be this perfect healer so much as like letting it lead me, and letting it um, it do have its time. So it's I would really like to do MDMA. I swore I would never do ibogaine, and then I had a call yesterday with this incredible functional nutritionist that I'm working with, and is teaching me and others about nutrition and trauma, and some of the stuff she was describing about her experience with ibogaine and microdosing ibogaine. I was like, okay, I might microdose ibogaine, which I was like, where did that thought come? It was one of those things that came in my mind, and I was like, yeah, no. It's like you hear people say, "Don't tell God never."
Right.
It was like I didn't think that. I didn't think it. I'm never like, because I just like you described earlier, ibogaine's like this plant medicine of all plant medicine. Like if you were to really rock your world, do some ibogaine.
Yeah.
And so it's I was curious with myself that came up, but of course in true Kelly fashion, it's like, oh, I'll just do a microdose because it can't be that bad. Which I guarantee you, I'll do the microdose and it'll be like this crazy journey. Um, but what was interesting about the ayahuasca was that it looped me back into my psilocybin journey, like some very specific things. And I didn't I didn't know that could happen. So now I'm curious to talk to some of my mentors that have a lot more work in this space, because I didn't know that could happen. So it was some very distinct places that looped me back in.
Yeah. It's really interesting because you reminded me of something I wanted to ask you about. You had mentioned this at the panel that we met at, um, about having psychedelic experiences without psychedelics.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was months. I mean, scientifically, there is no way medicine would have been in my system. Um, One time it was with music, and it just triggered something in my brain, and it's that same process of your brain. Um, I don't want to say shutting off, but like that deeper psyche, deeper soul
Yeah,
taking
like
over.
taking a back seat,
Yeah,
essentially. Yeah.
and just eh, letting it go, and it's happened a couple of times. My husband was driving one time. One time we were just at home, and something came on. One time I was just going to bed, and I was like, all of a sudden, everything just started shutting down, and I've learned not to be afraid of it. And so it's really interesting because I know I'm not the only one that's had that experience. Like, but at the same time, the way it's opened up my psyche and in my neuro pathways it's really, um, I can access it kind of at will. And with breath work, I mean, that was this church that I spoke about. Where I did ayahuasca. The before we drank the ayahuasca, we did a breath work ceremony, and that scared the tar out of me. I didn't expect to. I know you can get to a place of journeying with breath work, but you're much more in control, so you can escalate it at will.
Yeah.
But I didn't expect to get there that quickly. And I was so grateful for that experience because I kind of panicked. I was like, wait, I'm not supposed to be journeying now. And so when it came time to take ayahuasca, I was like, wait a minute, let go. I reminded me to let go. Because if I'd let go in the breath work, I could have had a cool experience.
Yeah.
But it did serve me well later because it reminded me, okay, when things get scary, it's okay to let go. Um, and so anyway, and then another time was in yoga. I was doing yoga. And I, I woke up after, and it was before Shavasana. Like it wasn't supposed to be the planned relaxed time, but I woke up and was like, glad people are still here. Like, because I definitely wasn't.
Yeah.
And I have no idea of how long out of that class I was journeying. But so yeah, it's really a willingness. What I found in myself is that it's a willingness to surrender when whether you spirituality, your subconscious, like when your body, when your soul, your psyche is ready to open up, a willingness to just explore
Yeah.
as opposed to allow fear to shut it down. And so I think that probably a lot of us have that happen throughout life, but we don't understand it. You know, whether people that are doing plant medicine probably more so than not, but if you haven't had plant medicine, you don't realize even daydreaming a little bit, right? Like if you really let yourself go and let yourself follow, you can get to a really cool spot.
Yeah.
But we don't we don't give ourselves permission to explore like we should.
Yeah, I mean that was definitely my experience of everything being locked down so tightly. But then also, I think the one that you had mentioned at the panel was during yoga, and I really appreciated that because you're the first person who I had heard talk about that stuff. But this had also happened to me during yoga, and
Oh wow.
like
Yeah.
I, and I'm not like a person who's super into yoga,
Yeah.
but like I had done it like on and off throughout my 20s and 30s, and post plant medicine, like I remember being in a yoga class, and about 45 minutes in, I got hit by this memory, and it was like being on a journey, and for me, you had that experience of like checking out and checking back in, but for me, I was like, hey, I'm like having this very traumatic experience and all of these people are around, like this
Right.
does not feel okay.
Yeah.
And it happened again a number of times, like in subsequent yoga classes, and I got more used to it, but then also infrared sauna almost always triggers it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny because with both of those environments, there is a very specific threshold of time that has to pass before my body will switch over into that. And like with yoga, it's generally about 45 minutes, but
Yeah.
with infrared sauna, it's like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And like I started using infrared sauna as this very intentional, like instead of actually introducing plant-based medicine into my system so frequently, like I could use infrared sauna as this replacement, and
Wow.
like it's definitely like a lower level, but
Yeah.
I can still have these insights and this productive work without needing to invoke plant medicine.
Interesting. That's really fascinating. I have to look into that. Do you have one here? You go like
Yeah.
where's okay. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, there's one pretty close by that is very affordable, so
Yeah.
yeah, I go pretty
Huh.
frequently.
I'm gonna check that out. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and my impression is that it's different for a lot of
Yeah.
people. But my instinct is also like the combination of breath work and movement in yoga is what triggers that experience. I don't know what it is about infrared sauna
Yeah.
that triggers it, but at least that's my impression with yoga.
Yeah.
The next question I wanted to ask about was your work with integrative coaching and then
Hmm.
also recovery for addiction. Can you talk about that work, like how you found it and also like what forms that takes for you now?
Yeah. Um, so I found it through, I fell in love with the process of recovery and just helping people. So I am innately, I mean, yes, my codependency needed to get in check, but I love people and I love helping people, and I um, am just wired to see people. And we talked about that a little bit offline. Um, and so in the recovery space, I found that I saw people for who they are and just enjoying and loving them where they are, but then having the tools to help them forward. And I guess in the recovery world, sponsorship is that being a sponsor of someone would be um, the easiest way to describe that. But even with people that weren't my sponsees, just really wanting to come alongside of them, and not in an ego way, like not that I had the tools, but that I could just walk alongside of you and reflect back, and hopefully that enabled you to heal.
So if someone were to engage with you for integration, like what might that process look like?
Yeah, I have it. It's structured a couple different ways. My ideal is that it's a minimum of a 5 session package, which I modeled that around what I experienced with vets in Mission Within, would be 2 before, and then 3 after, and then availability to add on. But understanding someone before plant medicine helps a lot in processing what they're telling you their journey was about.
Right.
And I can absolutely, and there plenty of people help people integrate without having the full story. But it certainly helps that you have pre-medicine and post-medicine information. Um, and that looks like just like I'd said earlier, you just walk alongside somebody. It's listening, it's paying attention to detail and finding those threads in what they say, and then looking at what was reflected to them in the medicine, and then what it is that they're wanting to let go of or not wanting to let go of, but the medicine's shown them that it's time to let go of. And then I'll do one time I've met with several people that um, learn what I do, and they just want one session, and they feel like they get answers for whatever they need at the moment. But it makes me, and no judgment to anybody, it makes me think of going to those counselors, like, right, or like you and I talked off mic, like they got what they needed in the moment.
Right.
The process might not be done, but they got enough information to manage for the foreseeable future. And they may be back, they might not, or they might find somebody else, but they got what they needed to manage that situation. But I do, if someone comes to me and says that they want to do plant medicine, and we do the prep work, and then they do plant, and I haven't had this yet, but it is stated in my policy. It's one of the only few policies I have. And they did prep work, and then they did plant medicine, but were unwilling to integrate. It would have to be a very real conversation for me to work with you again,
Yeah.
because I don't believe, and I see this a lot with people with ketamine. They just want to go back for the ketamine hits, and they don't want to do the work in between, so that ketamine's not the answer,
Yeah.
because it just becomes like any other, prescription med.
Yeah.
So it is very important to me that I have boundaries around people, and it's okay if they don't want to do the work. I've spent plenty of my life not wanting to do the work,
Yeah.
but I'm not gonna sign off on you doing plant medicine um, recreationally. You can do that, but not as me as in wanting to do it in a therapeutic sense.
Yeah. It's not going to be a good fit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, as you mentioned a few moments ago, I think your willingness to share your experiences with vulnerability and honesty has made this a really beautiful conversation and one that I think people can draw a lot of value from. If somebody wanted to connect with you or find out more about you, are there places that they can do that at?
Unfor Unfortunately, the answer to that is no.
Okay.
So I need to get, and that's part of me just being brave and stepping into who I am, and not worrying about what, how it comes across. So, I the power within you 2013 at gmail.com, is the email address attached to that. But you're the third person in 48 hours that's asked me that. So now I'm going to have to go because, yeah, the yoga studio where I do a class, and I'm not a yogi. I'm like you, like I've dabbled in yoga, but that's not ever, I'm not a yogi. Um, but they asked me the other day, they're like, you need to have a profile page and a picture and all that stuff. So I will do it.
Okay. Well, Kelly, really appreciate the time today and the insights. I think this has been awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation. I'm really grateful for it.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah. Thank you.